Sid, thank you for joining me. Let's talk growing experimentation program team structure, and just general structure of these things, and how we grow, and what's included in them. First, introduce yourself. Let us know, let the people watching here know how and where you're relevant to this topic.
Hey Ben, happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me. My name is Sid Bakhru. I am a director of product marketing and experimentation at Hulu, now part of Disney Streaming. I started my journey as a product manager at Hulu and then gradually made my way to the growth marketing team at Hulu, where my team and I run experimentation on our landing pages and then coordinate very closely with the team that runs experimentation in our sign up flow. So across the sign up journey.
Nice, nice. You wrote a cool article, and we'll link it for those watching. You wrote a cool article 2 years ago about uh, experimentation program center of excellence, and you had the article was, began with you had created the center of excellence, and then it went through some of the details on what were some of the important parts, how it took off. Can you give me the background of that? That was 2 years ago, so I want you to sort of give me a little bit of the background there, a little bit of the story arc of creating that center of excellence, and then the journey to maybe a little bit where you are today. And I might like interrupt you and ask a couple questions within there, because that's at least a 2, if not a 3 year journey, if I'm asking you to provide that context about that. So give me the context of that article and where you were 2 years ago, and then kind of the story arc of what happened after.
Right. Happy to. So the article came out of, my experiences and the team's experiences kind of launching this experimentation journey. And my entry into the world of experimentation at Hulu happened because of this journey of decentralization and the founding of the Center of Excellence. So um, I worked very closely with the centralized team in Hulu marketing that ran all of our web experimentation, right? And uh, they were kind of like this hub and spoke model where they sat in the center, they only did experimentation, and they collaborated with product managers, marketing managers, creative teams, finance, so on and so forth to run experimentation on all these touch points. Now, as we were early in our crawl, walk, run journey, and so the number of experiments were fairly low. Velocity was fairly low. But there inevitably came a point wherein there started to be a little bit of friction between the vision of the marketing managers and the product managers and the kind of like the central team that ran experimentation. And this is your, you know, often repeated kind of story. Do product managers and marketing managers should they be responsible for experimentation as part of their everyday jobs, or should this be kind of spun out into its own function? For us, um, what we decided to do was kind of approach this in a scientific way. So we kind of involved a consulting company or an agency to help us understand the problem statement, interview all the stakeholders, figure out where the bottlenecks were, figure out what the goals were. And after this entire process of working with a consulting agency, the outcome was that the best way forward in order to achieve our goals, which were two. Goal number one, we want to increase velocity. And goal number two, we want to make sure that everyone is thinking about experimentation as a natural part of their work. So, with these two goals in mind, coming out of that consulting exercise, we decided to move away from the centralized approach and decentralize experimentation. What that meant was that the original team that ran this would become the center of excellence. They would kind of dissipate the best practices and their learnings into all these new teams that were being formed to take on experimentation. The new teams that were being formed to take on experimentation we just decided to call them pods. And you have, as you see in my article, you have this one individual called the optimization strategist who would become the new kind of driving force of the quarterback behind the experimentation process within each team. And by teams here, I mean like touch points, right? You have a team focused on landing pages, a team focused on the sign up flow, you have another team focused on retention, for example, or cancel and save in a subscription business, right? And the optimization strategist would then take on the role of um, ensuring that the experimentation program moves forward with the velocity that we want to see. Um, the pods essentially include one representative from all the various stakeholder teams that are involved in experimentation, right? You have uh, creative, finance, engineering, product, marketing, legal, customer service for that feedback loop, right? So on and so forth. And then, as the article says, we decided to kind of determine what our processes and artifacts need to be in order to make this like a more structured approach. So I'll get into, the specifics of the artifacts and the process in a later response, but for when we decided to move away from the centralized approach into this pods based approach, we immediately saw velocity spike because now you had so many more practitioners taking charge of their individual touch points. You had so many more practitioners kind of become the quarterbacks to increase velocity, and then you have so many more teams uh, that are kind of laser focused on their one touch point, which they already knew inside out. And the result was we saw velocity increase, we saw win rates go up, and we essentially saw a lot less friction that we were seeing before between the central team and these individual practitioners.
So I want to dig in there because I'm actually less curious or less interested in talking about like the standardization artifacts, like the way that the pipeline works or the way that you form a hypothesis. I think that's published on a lot. I
Right,
mean, these, Airtable setups and stuff like
right,
this.
right, right, right,
But I'm really curious to dig in a little bit further on your transition from centralized to decentralized or this to center of excellence. You mentioned setting up these pods, but I imagine there were already teams that were running on the touch point. There were already teams that were in charge or ownership of a particular swim lane, touch point, however you want to call it. So talk to me a little bit more deeper about that transition on taking that existing team, which I'm assuming there was an existing team, and then transitioning it into like a, an optimization pod or
right.
to get them to go from not experimenting to
Yeah,
experimenting
right,
like that's people we talk about that transition, but that's I think where the change management like gets stuck.
right, right,
So
right.
talk to me about
So,
that.
so that's actually not entirely true for us. It wasn't entirely true for us. We had
uh,
one team that was running experiments across this entire series of touch points in our sign up journey and retention journey, right? One team. And then you have separate kind of channel owners or touch point owners, so to speak, that were responsible for feature development, right? Across
yeah.
these touch points. So, like I was saying before, you inevitably had a little bit of friction between this one team that was running experiments and these touch point owners because they were essentially competing for the same resources, and you know they had different hypotheses, different kind of processes and ideas for what the future of these touch points look like, right? The other issue here was that central team, the one team, became a bottleneck because
Yeah, totally.
you have this one team kind of responsible for pushing out concurrent experiments across multiple touch points and just not enough people to do the work, right? The very basic problem, right? Um, so when the mental model shift really was for these touch point owners or channel owners who wanted to do experimentation to kind of take over some of the work from from that one team that was previously doing the work, right? Um, you obviously have a little bit of politics that come into play. You have
I
a
was
little
going
bit
to
of
ask you about leadership because you
right.
have a feature team. You have a team that's being given a roadmap,
Yes.
and now you're asking them to take ownership of their own roadmap.
Yes.
Talk
So
to me
you
about
have a
that.
team, you have a kind of product feature team that is responsible for road mapping of the product, but they were not necessarily employing experimentation to kind of inform that roadmap or pursuing a, you know, test often, fail often, break things approach, right? It was just pure feature development,
Ship and hope.
shipping, right?
Yeah.
Experimentation was more of this is something we want to do, we like to do it, but it was an afterthought, right? And part of that was because of how things always were. They were always kind of run by this one team, right? So you now have this power dynamic wherein there's one team that does experimentation. You have another team that wants to take some of that responsibility and start to do experimentation, right? That's part one. But then part two is absorbing that comes with the responsibility of actually running experimentation. It needs resources, it needs bandwidth, right? So to achieve all of that, you need two things. One, you need like a sponsor at the highest level who will say, this is the model that we want to follow for experimentation going forward. And you need validation, right? Validation came from that consulting study, from the experts who came in and said, we studied you, we studied your org, we studied your issues. We think that based on what we've seen elsewhere, this is the model you want to follow.
Yeah.
Once we then had that internal sponsor, things kind of became a little easier to transfer this power to the feature teams and for that the previous central team to kind of serve more of uh, they were going to serve as uh, folks to guide us in our journey.
Did you have, and this is awesome, I'm totally going off script, so
Oh, good.
which is a great sign. So are there any, that leadership story, you need sponsor at the highest level. Was there a shift in accountability? Meaning that if you had this ship and hope culture, you had this feature team like that was just shipping on a roadmap. They owned the roadmap, but they were just shipping according to whatever they decided, like some kind of OKR systems or whatever that they
Right.
put in front of themselves. When you set up this new model, did their accountability system change? The incentives change to run more experimentation and to get results out of the learning that they're doing through experimentation, to get those results and to demonstrate those results. So can you talk to me about metrics or accountability systems within those pods and how that might have
Yes.
shifted?
So that is a great point, and that is absolutely what happened and what needs to happen, right? It's not just about um, running more experiments for the sake of it, right? It's about why are we doing this? So when the responsibility of experimentation got like transferred to these pods, it came with very specific OKRs about what these pods are going to do, and it came with incentives. So again, tying back to that sponsor, um, couple of things, right? One is um, creating creating enough bandwidth and resources for these individual pods to actually run experimentation, creating space for them to run experiments, right? That comes with not just time to develop, not just time to create and run, but also developmental engineering resources, design resources to actually enable this to happen, right? And you have to understand that there's always potential that these things could fail. You don't have winning experiments. Things could, your metrics aren't positive, so on and so forth, right? So there has to be kind of like that safety net created by the sponsor and the safety net created by each of these teams' leaders to say, we are going to create the safe space for you to try this experiment, run more experiments, give you or carve out let's say 5 or 10% of engineering resources, design resources for you to incorporate this in your regular sprints, right? So this is absolutely essential. It needs to happen because um, tendency for product teams is to ship, right? Ship new features, ship new things. Um, Experimentation is an after. If it's an afterthought, you need to create space for this to kind of become part of your culture, become part of your sprints, become part of your conversations. So, kind of tying it all together, um, we had the sponsor, we had a little bit of kind of 5 or 10% of capacity created for engineering. And then the kind of biggest thing that you need to create is the freedom to fail within each of these pods, right? And I know that's just a little bit of fancy words, but it's really, really important to tell people, tell these pods, go do what you need to do. And it's fine if things don't work out in the first couple of quarters, right? We're giving you 6 months, we're giving you 9 months to go start doing things, and you'll eventually find your footing.
Yeah. Awesome. So I want to ask you about a little the current state now and kind of that we kind of what we talked about was all the past, but I want to talk to you real briefly before we end this because I like it for it to be somewhat
Sure.
concise, these little videos, but this is great going a little bit over. Um, but before I ask you that, I mean, is there some metrics that you could share, and it's okay if you can't, in terms of like the velocity during the centralized bottleneck stages and then what you ended up doing later on? Can you talk to me about like before and after numbers at all?
Um, Not specific numbers, and I mean it was also a long time ago, but
Yeah, yeah.
I think I think there's like three metrics that we decided to track very early on. Um, One is the financial metric that is absolutely important to your business, right? You identify that, make sure that you have sign off from everyone who needs to sign off, and you assign that kind of top line or bottom line metric, whatever it is, to your experimentation program. And essentially, if you're doing it right, you are going to produce an increase in that top line or bottom line metric through experimentation, going from zero to that number because you weren't experimenting before. You're using your existing traffic or existing users to bring about an incremental change to your top line or bottom line, right? And that's what happened for us, right? For example, if there was, uh, you know, uh, $0 coming from zero incremental dollar gains coming from experimentation before, you now had 100 incremental dollars coming from experimentation because we could tie it back specifically to the work we were doing for experimentation. So that's the financial metric. The second is um, velocity. We know that most tests fail, and so we thought it was important straight off the bat that you want to run as many tests as possible to give yourself higher odds or higher chances of producing uh, winning results. And then the third one is kind of less, I would say, less quantitative, but it's more like what do your teams enjoy working on? What do your teams want to be doing? And for our pods, we found that the the weekly kind of meetings, the artifacts, kind of rallying around this process and practice of experimentation was something that a lot of the folks involved really enjoyed doing. It inspired them to do their best work. And now you can't really track that, but we found a lot of people across the company, across teams,
Awesome.
gravitating towards these
Yeah.
pods. They wanted to be involved, right? And that's not necessarily measurable, but I think it's such an important part. If you are taking the right steps in creating that culture of experimentation, you have some winners, you have some positive results, you share it out widely, and you get your leaders kind of buying into it more and more, you'll find the best talent in your company gravitating towards this practice. And that is something that, I think has been really transformative for us because everyone wants to do it. And so everyone tries to kind of create that space, that capacity that I was talking about.